A Loving Duke for the Shy Duchess. Written by Abby Ayles and published by Starfall Publications. Save more with our offers and bundles on our website starfallpublicationsbooks.com. Subscribe for more audiobooks. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The early morning was the most precious to Lucille Barrington. She treasured the quiet that hung about the house before the sun split the sky, the moments before even the servants were up and about, when she could slip along the velvet carpets of her new home in silence, run her fingers along the banister as tenderly as a child, curl up in the study with only a book and her own thoughts. She would have walked outside in the elaborate gardens too, if it weren't for her husband's concerns on the subject. He seemed to think the early morning a prime time for catching dangerous chills, and he had told her only a few days into their marriage that he worried about her walking in the gardens alone without a shawl. She hadn't returned since. This particular morning, Lucille woke before the birds, dressed quickly in a green silk gown that set off her emerald eyes, pinned her hair back as properly as she knew she ought, put a thick shawl around her shoulders, and tiptoed from her bedroom towards the study downstairs. Doing so, she had to pass her husband's door. Reginald Barrington, the Duke of Crowan, a man arrayed in all the mystery and splendour of wealth and circumstance, who had married her 6 months ago after a flurry of excitement surrounding her sister, Sarah's marriage to Augustus Sutton of Whitehall. So many months, and yet Lucille still felt she was sneaking by the door of a stranger as she tiptoed downstairs. She hardly knew Reginald. They hadn't even consummated their marriage, not after the first night, when he'd told her that he knew it was an arranged affair. He knew that she was frightened, and he promised not to do anything until she explicitly requested his attentions. "You have nothing to fear from me," he had said the first night. "I will not be a duty you have to fulfill. Come to me if you wish to, but until you wish otherwise, I will have a room for you at the opposite end of the hall, and you may rest there undisturbed." She'd been so grateful at the time, shaking like a leaf at the thought of being with a man she hardly knew, but as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, she felt her already limited knowledge of Reginald Barrington was growing more and more frail. She didn't know that man who lived down the hall from her, who'd given her his name and his estate, and maybe even his heart, for Lucille couldn't deny that there was something in his eyes that spoke of love, even if he couldn't bring himself to be so forthright. She only wished she knew how to reach out of her fear and touch his heart. She wished she wanted to reach out. Instead, she felt stopped up, like a wax figure in a museum, rather than a real woman. "I cannot help you with this," her sister Sarah had explained when she confessed these fears. "You have to find a way to speak with your own husband. Tell him your concerns and ask him what is wrong. I'm sure he'll be more than happy to bare his soul to you." But Lucille knew better. Reginald Barrington was not the kind of man who bared his soul to anyone. Lucille knew that she of all people, with her shrinking fear of crowds, her confusion about what to say and when to speak the truth, would be the last person in whom Reginald ever confided. He was the opposite of her in every way, a strong-minded man who knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to get it. He spoke quickly, had a sharp mind, and prized all things intellectual. He was also a bit vulpine. Lucille had always thought so, and she wasn't ever sure whether he spoke the truth or was manipulating the facts to his own ends. He could do that. She'd seen him turn men on their heads with only a few sentences, pulling affirmatives from men who'd promised never to give in, twisting the House of Lords around with his logic on an almost daily occasion. Lucille opened the door to the library and slipped inside, expecting to light a candle as usual and pick up her book until the morning light fought with the flame. To her surprise, she saw that a fire had already been started in the hearth, and she caught sight of her husband's slim, sloping shoulders, against the back of the settee. She froze, took a soundless step backward and turned as though to flee when he stopped her. "Good morning, Lucille." His voice was smooth and deep. His eyes still turned away from her towards the fire. "I didn't mean to disturb you." She took another step away. "You didn't—" "How did you know I was here?" she ventured, hoping he wouldn't turn around. The intensity of his gaze, the cool removal of his countenance, always befuddled her. "I know you come here in the mornings, and I thought to warm the room beforehand, and perhaps catch you before I left for the day." He turned then, but the light of the fire cast his face into shadow. Lucille swallowed hard. "Thank you." "But you're backing away. Have you changed your mind about reading in your usual spot?" He waved toward the settee, and she looked at it wordlessly, not knowing what to say. They were married, yes, but the nearness to Reginald still felt strange, like being scandalously close with a stranger. It was an intimacy she could not yet stomach. "I don't want to interrupt you." He stood suddenly, his face still hidden in shadow, but she heard the edge in his voice. "I was only coming to invite you to dinner with me this evening," he said. "I know I've been eating in town as of late, and you so often take your meals in your room, but I desire your presence with me when I return from the House of Lords." Lucille knew she'd done something wrong, but she wasn't sure what it was, and she certainly didn't know how to fix it. She swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll be there." He walked past her, brushing up against her arm as he went, and bid her good day at the door with a deep bow and his eyes averted. She murmured a response, and when he was gone, she couldn't help thinking of the contrast between their cold interaction and the interactions she'd seen so often between Sarah and her husband Augustus. Those two had fallen in love under the strangest of circumstances, and yet they seemed to be deeply in love. Sarah had initially agreed to take Lucille's place when their father, Edgar Lockridge, had demanded that Lucille marry the Duke of Whitehall. Sarah and Lucille were identical twins, and for a time the misdirection worked. Everyone thought that Sarah was Lucille, and Lucille was Sarah. Everyone, except Reginald, that is. He had known from the first time he met Sarah that she was not Lucille, and had asked Lucille for her hand in marriage only 2 months later. Lucille still didn't know his reasons for this strange request. She'd accepted to help Sarah the way Sarah had helped her, and because she had seen at last that it was as safe a future as she could hope to have. Her father was a dangerous and manipulative man. When Sarah married Augustus, he would surely not be satisfied until Lucille was also carted away to a man of his choosing. At least Reginald seemed to respect her, whatever their difficulties were otherwise. Sarah had sacrificed everything, her reputation, her wealth, and her status, to intervene and save Augustus from Edgar's blackmail. Lucille had even helped in her own way, a spurt of courage that now seemed far away, like it belonged to a different woman. She changed for dinner, more out of habit than necessity. Reginald had never mentioned a particularly favourite gown or colour on her, but she'd grown up with a father who picked at every little thing she did or wore, and she had always changed before dinner with him. She felt she ought to do the same for Reginald, to at least try to please him. She put on a grey silk dress with fine lace around the neck, put her hair up again, and used pearls as accents all around. Coupled with her almost white blonde hair, she thought it looked a little ghostly, but it would have to do. Reginald was already in the dining room when she arrived, talking to the cook about some household matter or other. He still managed most of the estate, and Lucille didn't mind. The idea of keeping an entire household afloat terrified her. "Sir," she curtsied when he turned to see her, as the cook bowed out of the room. "Lucille." He turned to her with a question creasing his forehead. He was dressed as he'd been that morning. Tan trousers, and a fine blue statesman's coat. His long dark hair was tied back at the base of his neck, and those dark eyes of his were watching, always watching. "I've told you before, you don't have to call me sir." "Of course," she said quickly, stumbling over her words. "I don't mean anything by it. It's habit." Habit? He showed her over to her seat, mechanically almost, and pulled back her chair. "Have you been married to many other gentlemen that I don't know about?" She blushed, knowing that he was teasing her but unsure how to respond. The past few days, she'd felt something brewing, a certain scowling in his countenance and an even more removed nature than usual. She feared that this dinner was the culmination of all that confusion, a chance for Reginald to at last call her out on whatever issue was bothering him. She was afraid. "How was your day?" he asked as soon as the first course had been served, and she dipped her spoon into the creamy soup. "Good," she answered quickly, automatically. "I walked about the grounds a bit. The new gardener you hired was putting in bushes, and I helped him." She trailed off, wondering if this had been a misstep. "If that's all right, I don't know if you would mind." "Mind you getting some fresh air and using that mind of yours?" "Not at all." There was no edge in his voice, though Lucille listened for one as she'd used to listen for the changing moods of her father. He just seemed weary, like something was weighing heavily on his shoulders. Lucille found herself wishing they had the kind of relationship where he might feel free to unburden himself to her, but as soon as the thought came into her mind, she banished it. Reginald was clearly a smart and capable man. He would have no need for a girl like her. "Thank you," she said softly, taking another spoonful of soup. He looked at her in silence for a moment, and then shook his head. "What is it that I do?" he said, with a hard note creeping into his voice. "That frightens you so? Stop cringing, Lucille. I've never hurt you. I've never said an unkind word to you." He threw his napkin down on the table, and despite herself, Lucille tensed. He caught the slight movement and sighed, running his hand along his forehead. "Like now, I'm just asking you a question, and you're choosing to shrink away from me in fear rather than answering me forthrightly." Lucille laid her spoon down, keeping her eyes on her hands. "I'm sorry, sir." "Don't," he interrupted. "Not sir." "Lucille, I've given you everything. Complete liberty to do and think as you like. I've asked nothing from you, nothing. And yet you still treat me as though I am some villain scheming against your happiness." The word villain sparked a memory in Lucille, one she'd thought of often since they'd got married, and she looked up with a rare spurt of honesty. "Perhaps you are a villain to some," she said softly. "You have given me everything, yes, but I know that you are not always an honourable man. My sister says you're a merchant of secrets, and I know that secrets hurt people." And here we have the truth at last. There was a flicker of pain in Reginald's eyes, but before Lucille could fully confirm it, he'd pushed it aside again, putting the mask on his face. "You are afraid of me." Lucille swallowed hard and dropped her eyes. That wasn't all she meant to say, but she felt all her thoughts and fears piling up inside her. The more that rose, the harder it was to speak. "I'm sorry to see such a fear in my own wife." His voice was hoarse with feeling. "I'll do whatever I can to assuage those fears. Tell me what it is you would have me do." She looked at him soberly, and the old memory came back into her mind. "When I was helping Sarah with Augustus, I burned some blackmail our father had. I saw your name, but I burned it nonetheless without reading it. Tell me what the paper said." He looked steadily across the table at her, his face a sober mask. He opened his mouth once as though to speak, and then shut it again just as quickly. "I'm sorry," he said, laying aside his spoon and standing abruptly. It appears this meal was not such a good idea after all. Lucille watched him go, wondering at the loneliness that always accompanied his absence. She didn't love him. Of course, she didn't love him. What, then, was this yearning in her heart? Chapter 2. In the dream, Reginald was standing over Isaac Caney, and he had blood on his hands. There was blood on the ground, and all around, the hunters were chanting something he couldn't understand. He woke with sweat drenching his head and sat up in the darkness. He'd turned into bed early after the dinner with Lucille, unable to spend one more moment looking at the disappointment creasing the face of the most beautiful woman he'd ever known. He stood by that statement, even though Sarah looked so like her twin sister. He had been able to tell she wasn't Lucille in an instant. He'd always believed that when a man studies a thing as Reginald had studied Lucille, he can at once understand when a counterfeit is offered him. Now, lying in bed with the dream still fresh in his mind, Reginald reached up with a shaking hand and felt a film of sweat on his brow. That awful day came back to him even in the daylight, when he had to bury it away with all the other things from his past he wanted to forget. But at night, the dead came back out of their graves, and he was racked with guilt even now at the memory of Isaac Caney's slack face and staring eyes. The accident had never been ultimately pinned on his gun, after all. There was no conclusive evidence that it had been his bullet in the melee that had killed Isaac. But somehow the lack of certainty was worse than just knowing. He couldn't fully accept the role of villain and repent. Yet he couldn't walk with a clear conscience either. He swung his legs out of bed, fumbled in the dark until he'd lit a candle, and then slipped his arms into his floor-length brocade dressing gown. He glimpsed his own face in the mirror and jumped a little, startled by how sallow and pale he looked. This slender, mincing appearance favoured him well in most of his business, coming across as intellectual, politically savvy, and a man with a secret to hide, always intimidated the bullish idiots who tried to push their self-serving bills through the House of Lords. But Reginald could see why his appearance and mystique had done nothing to win over the heart of Lucille Lockridge, now turned Lucille, Duchess of Crowan. He felt a sudden yearning to go to her, to bury his face in that feather-soft hair and breathe deeply of her smell. Sometimes, when she wasn't looking, he would let his gaze settle on her from afar and soak up the sight of her the way a thirsty man in the desert revels in even a drop of water. She was so much more than he had ever imagined, and yet he felt he had condemned himself to a lifetime of torment by marrying her. She would always be right there, needing to be loved, but neither accepting his love nor giving him any in return. He didn't fully understand why, but whatever the reason, it was clear that Lucille was frightened of him. Earlier today, at the dinner table, he had been reminded of a puppy his father had purchased for him when he was a boy. The poor thing had been the runt of the litter, and a badly kept litter at that. A full month old when Reginald received the little thing, the puppy had been beaten and frightened into a trance-like submission. When Reginald first reached out to pet the creature, the puppy had shivered uncontrollably with fear, not moving away lest such behaviour be punished, but not moving an inch closer either. That's how Lucille seemed, as though she was bearing up under his presence, because it was what was expected of her, although Reginald could see that same shivering fear in her as well, and he hated it. He wanted to find a way to help her, to quiet her nerves, to show her that she was everything he needed, and even if she wasn't, he would never lay a hand on her. He put his slippers on and walked out into the silent hall, having no idea what time it was. The servants must be already abed, Lucille too, for the candle was the only light in the house as he made his way downstairs, and his almost noiseless slippers the only disturbance. As he walked, he thought of that tailor Lucille had once loved. She'd called off the dalliance, the infatuation, as she called it at the time, as soon as Reginald proposed, but it hurt him more than he could even admit to himself. The tailor was evidence that she could treasure and be treasured. She just chose not to extend that gift to him. "There's no hope for romance once you've already married the girl," one of his coarser friends had said the week after his wedding when they were drinking at the pub across from Parliament. "You can woo a mistress to eternity, but once you're sharing a home and a reputation, the love is lost." The man had been joking, of course, but the statement had grated against Reginald's memory ever since. How did one woo one's own wife? He had avoided her bedroom like the plague because it was vitally important to him that she felt safe above all else. But even if she eventually agreed to do her marital duty, what then? A child would only give her something else to care about, meaning for their union that would pull her once and for all away from him instead of towards him. Her words at dinner that night still stabbed him as he slipped down the stairs. "Perhaps you are a villain to some." It had been a brave thing to say, and Reginald had been torn at the moment between wanting to applaud her rare show of courage and wanting to sink with shame under the pain of what she implied. It was revelatory to see himself at last as she saw him, that narrow man with his hands on the strings of so many men, a merchant of secrets, as she called him. It wasn't like that in reality. He knew he'd made mistakes, but he tried to be careful with his choices, leveraging situations for the greater good and protection of others instead of blackmailing people to line his pockets. But maybe that was an argument about the ends justifying the means, and maybe Lucille would turn her head away from such explanations if he tried to give them. He intended to pull one of his obscure books on ancient medieval philosophy from the shelf in the library and use it as medicine against the doubts in his own mind. However, when he opened the door, he was startled to see the fire was still flickering dimly in the fireplace, and his little wife was curled up in the settee with a letter in her hand. She was dressed in a nightgown, an uncommon sight for the lovesick husband, a long, white, filmy thing with lace edging around the neck and long sleeves. Her hair, so blonde it was almost white, fell to her waist, spilling over her shoulder like a gentle waterfall. Her little eyes were turned down to study the letter, her wrists arched over the paper like the wings of a sparrow. She took his breath away, and he paused for a moment in the doorway. That movement, stopping suddenly, caused her to look up with a stifled cry of surprise and, as always, fear. When she realised that it was him and not a stranger, the fear only edged slightly. "My lord." She stumbled a little, trying to stand, her little legs getting tangled in the folds of her nightgown, and pulled the thick green shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'm so sorry to disturb you. I thought you were abed, or else I would not have imposed on the library." Reginald felt a slew of phrases piling up in his head. "You are not disturbing me. Please don't go from me again, Lucille. You're always running, and it breaks my heart." But he couldn't bring himself to let them free of his lips. He just looked at her steadily, trying to find a way around her fear and his own pride. She looked confused and sat down again, folding the letter ever so gently with her slender little hands, and then crossing those hands in her lap. "My lord." She let the question hang in her voice. That second, "my lord," did it. Reginald couldn't bear to hear that fearful question in her voice. He went to her, crossing the room in a few steps of his long legs, and kneeling down suddenly at her feet. Lucille's face paled for a moment in vague surprise, clearly uncertain, but Reginald made no attempt to rise or to use his silver tongue to charm her. Instead, he put his head on her knees, like a child coming to his mother for comfort. There was a moment of utter stillness, and he knew she must be thinking frantically about what to do and what was proper. Then he heard the rustle of her hands, laying aside the letter, and felt them touch, feather soft, the back of his neck. She had no way of knowing, but her touch was like lightning in his bones. "Are you all right?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft like the flickering firelight. She so rarely initiated conversation with him that at first Reginald was unsure how to respond. In the end, he was surprised into a moment of rare honesty. "I am not all right," he murmured, "but I might be, if you will just stay here with me. Don't leave." The little hand resting on the back of his neck moved gently to his hair and began stroking it ever so tentatively. Her touch was uncertain, but brave. He could feel that bravery in her fingers, and he loved her for it. Heavens, he loved her, with everything in him. "There's room." She cleared her throat as though her voice had failed her. "There's room up here if you want to rest." It was so strange of her to offer further intimacy that he raised his head, at first not believing her, and she dropped her eyes at once, and he took his cue not to press the issue, merely following her hand, patting the settee gently beside her. He stood and climbed by her side, putting his head back in her lap and laying lengthwise beside her, his eyes on the fire. He wanted more than anything to look up and catch a glimpse of that delicate little face, to know what she was thinking and feeling. But he also was content basking in her presence. After months of ice and distance, it felt both beautiful and strange, like a gift that he'd heard of other people enjoying, but never thought he could have for himself. Whatever her reason for extending the grace of her touch and her nearness, he didn't want her to reconsider, and stayed frozen under her touch until her hand stopped moving on his forehead, and he heard her breathing soften above him. He twisted just enough to catch sight of her face. Her head had fallen against the pillowed side of the settee, and her eyes were closed in sleep. Reginald reached up with a free hand and tucked the corner of her shawl a bit tighter around her shoulders, then resumed his position on her lap and watched the flames until sleep claimed him as well. Chapter 3. Lucille woke early, as she always did, reminded of the night before by the crick in her neck and the weight on her lap. Reginald was still there, his eyes shut in slumber. She looked down at him in mild surprise, remembering the events of the night before as though they had occurred only moments ago. He'd seemed so different then, and even now as he slept innocently in her lap, like a boy, less like a conniving man on a mission. He'd seemed broken last night, void for once of all his flowery language and manipulations. It had moved her enough to allow him to lay his head in her lap, and she'd surprised herself by falling fast asleep with him so near. His presence was comforting, soothing, as it had never before been. For the first time, Lucille felt like adding to that thought, as I have never before allowed it to be. Her heart was aching as she looked at his face, longing for his nearness for the first time, and yet too afraid to ask for it. He shifted as though he felt her gaze on his face and opened his eyes. For a moment he looked at her sleepily, trying to place his circumstances. Then his eyes widened ever so slightly, and he sat up, leaving her feeling a little vacant. "Did we sleep here all night?" he asked, rubbing a hand across his eyes. She nodded silently, willing herself to speak, to say anything, but finding herself speechless as always. He waited patiently, but when it was clear she planned not to add anything else, he seemed to accept her silence as usual, and stood from the settee, stretching out stiff limbs. "I have business to attend to in town," he said a little gruffly. "I suppose I will see you later on tonight?" She nodded again and watched silently as he took his leave of the library. He left a vacuum behind him. She realised with a little jolt that it had always been so, only now she was finally aware of it. She missed him. She stood and stretched as well, suddenly conscious that she was still wearing her nightgown and shawl. She waited until she could be sure of his absence before picking up the filmy skirts and following him from the library and into the hall. She intended to go upstairs, to change into proper attire and hope that no servants would find her downstairs in her nightgown. But she'd hardly made the grand staircase when she ran into one of the maids hurrying up with a tray, presumably to her own room. She froze in the shadows, but the maid caught the motion at once and turned in her direction. "Your Grace?" "Yes, it is I." Lucille stepped out, drawing her shawl closer around her shoulders. "You're up early, Millie." "As are you, Your Grace. Is everything all right?" A frown wrinkled the girl's forehead, and she peered at her new mistress's nightgown in obvious concern. Then, as though coming to herself, she looked down at the tray in her hand and gave a weak little laugh. "I was just coming up to your room. There was a letter for you that came during the night. Most urgent, I'm told, but the butler only just saw it when he unlocked the front doors this morning." A letter during the night? It was all a bit underhanded and exciting for Lucille, and she took a curious step forward. "Are you sure it is for me?" It was much more Reginald's speed to have secret letters delivered under cover of darkness. "It has your name on it, Your Grace." The maid curtsied, careful to hold the tray steady as she did so. Lucille heard a rustling upstairs, and, fearing that Reginald would be down soon to leave for the House of Lord, snatched the letter from the tray and gave a hurried little nod herself, making her way up to her room. She felt the maid's eyes on her as she went and wondered why she felt so silly and embarrassed. After all, was it such a terrible thing for a husband and wife to spend an evening together in their own home? It was unusual, yes, but only inasmuch as the Lord and Lady of Crowan had made it unusual with their distance and quietude. It was not untoward in any way. And yet Lucille, knowing exactly how much she'd kept her husband at arm's length since their marriage, couldn't help feeling that the few hours they dozed in each other's company had been a dramatic turning point. She ducked into her room without crossing paths with Reginald again, and made her way to the chair situated by the window. It was one of her favourite places in the whole of the house, tilted so that she could gaze out over the thin iron webbing of the balcony to the peaceful gardens behind. Reginald's tastes bordered on gaudy in the interior of the house, which was well hung with gilded portraits and lush carpets. But outside in his gardens, he used a lighter, more natural hand that calmed Lucille's spirits. There were sculpting and fine paths, but intermixed were small patches of wildflowers, drooping willows, and untrimmed vines that frolicked amongst all the order. Lucille curled up in the chair, pulled her shawl closer about her shoulders against the chill, and opened the letter. It was written in a hand she had only seen over her sister's shoulder in the past, that of the Duke of Whitehall, Sarah's new husband. "Lady Crowan," it began with the formality that always intimidated Lucille. "I am so sorry to have to write this to you, but last night your sister and I received word that your father had passed away suddenly. Your brother, Edmund, is set to inherit the title of Earl of Huxley in his place. Your sister wanted very much to send this news herself, or even in person, but we are hurrying over to the house ourselves to see to your mother and brother, and there is no time at present for her to write. Please consider coming over. I know this must be a shock to you, but your presence has always been a comfort to Sarah. If there's any way you could come and help, it would be appreciated. Sincerely, Augustus Sutton." Lucille realised she'd been holding her breath for the entirety of the letter, and now that it was over, she took a long, ragged gasp of air and let the paper fall unheeded into her lap. Her father was dead. She felt a stab of genuine grief, which surprised her. He hadn't been as other fathers, loving, kind, wholesome. He'd been cruel to her, dragging her down and criticising her and her sister for the smallest misstep. She had only a handful of treasured memories when he'd ever smiled at her, and those were darkened by the mood shifts that inevitably came afterwards. The last time Lucille had seen her father was at her wedding. Reginald did not favour them spending time under Edgar Lockridge's influence, and Lucille did not object. When Sarah and Augustus had been married, despite their father's best efforts to ruin Augustus, Lucille had helped destroy the blackmail Edgar held over Lord Whitehall's head, and Sarah had leaked additional scandal to the press to undermine her father's influence in the House of Lords. It was all very scandalous, and Edgar had not forgiven either daughter or ventured contact with them. Lucille was surprised, then, that she felt so oddly broken-hearted as she curled up in the chair and looked out the window. Instead of all the devastating memories of her childhood, she thought quite inexplicably of a moment when she was a very small girl, and she'd come upon her father in the garden, reading. She'd tiptoed clear of him then, not wanting to arouse in him the anger she already knew all too well, but he'd seen her and called her over. Instead of scolding her as per usual, he'd invited her up onto his lap and shown her a few words in the paper she could not yet read. "There's information that your papa did well in Parliament last week," he'd said with a hoarse little laugh. "Aren't you proud of me?" Little Lucille had not known what proud meant. "Yes," she'd answered with that faltering lisp her father had so hated. She remembered blushing after the fumble and waiting for him to mock her as usual, but instead he'd just winked at her, lifted her to the ground, and said in a jovial tone, "Yeth, indeed, my pet." Looking back, Lucille could only imagine that his inexplicable good mood had something to do with one of his schemes gone according to plan, which had only negative connotations for whatever poor person had been maligned in the paper. But still, she could see that wink and feel his arms lifting her to the ground. She fought the urge to go to Reginald, but, as if on cue, she heard a knock on her door and his voice calling for entrance. It was unprecedented, really. Her husband had made it clear that her rooms were her own space, and he would not invade her privacy, and yet here he was, knocking and asking to come in. Lucille stood, drawing the shawl over her chest and crossing her arms to hold it in place. She opened the door tentatively and looked out. Reginald was standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands, his riding coat already on, and the crop in his left palm. His face looked worried. "I'm sorry to disturb you here, but the maid mentioned an urgent letter that came last night." Lucille opened her mouth to tell him the truth, but then a thought came to her. Reginald had been open about his understandable dislike for Edgar Lockridge in the past, and Lucille felt certain that he would not want to attend a funeral for the chronic manipulator, especially considering the hold the now-deceased lord had held over Reginald's new little wife. She even suspected that he wouldn't want her to go to the house to see Sarah and Edmund. She swallowed hard, and before she could reconsider, lied. "I need to go see Sarah today," she said stiffly, "and my niece. I may not be back in time to share an evening meal with you, as we'd previously agreed." Reginald raised an eyebrow, clearly still concerned. "And it's urgent. Is little Letitia all right?" "Oh, they're both quite healthy," she rushed to assure him. "I just haven't seen them for some time. You know how servants can be, always making things seem more dramatic than they are." She was not made for the deceptive life, and even while she held to her lie, Lucille could feel the guilt of it all lodging in her chest like a sickness. Reginald didn't seem to fully believe her, but he nonetheless bowed stiffly and stepped away from her door. "Then I will leave you to it, my lady." He turned and strode away, Lucille watched him with that strange longing again in her heart. She wanted to go to him and tell him everything, but she could sooner have crossed the ocean. "I'm surprised Reginald was all right with you coming alone," Sarah said, wrapping her sister in an embrace. "Oh, you know how he is," Lucille said lamely, waving off her sister's concern and making an effort to change the subject. "Is everyone inside?" She'd arrived at her former home in the evening to find Sarah waiting outside on the front steps, perched on the marble with her knees to her chin, looking for all the world like a little girl. "Augustus is, but of course I left Letty at home. Edmund is too, but Mama didn't want to come." Sarah shrugged. "I can't say I blame her." Adding to the scandal around the Lockridge name, the girl's mother had finally left their abusive father a few months after Sarah and Augustus's marriage. She now lived with the couple in their grand home at Whitehall, and she seemed to be slowly crawling back out of the hole she'd lived in for most of her life, married to Edgar. Lucille followed Sarah inside. The halls were so familiar. She felt a creeping chill of memory up her back as she walked stiffly into the drawing room. Augustus was in deep conversation with Edmund by the fireplace. Other than that, there was no one else in the room. Edmund turned with a weak smile when he saw Lucille. He'd grown much over the past few years. The youngest Lockridge, he'd been heavily under his father's influence. Only recently had he made any attempt to break out of the mould, and the effort was a credit to him. He looked grim. "Thank you for coming, Lucille. I'm surprised at it all," she said softly, going to Edmund and taking his hands in hers. "It's very sudden, is it not? And I thought he was in good health." She caught a look between the other three that shot another chill down her spine. They were hiding something. "What is it?" she asked. "Please sit, Lucille." Sarah led her to the settee, and the four sat across from one another. "It wasn't sickness," Sarah began, seeming to draw strength from a glance she exchanged with her husband. "Father fell from the balcony that overlooks the lower gardens." Lucille gasped and put her hand to her mouth. "They're calling it an accident," Edmund said. He shifted for a moment in his seat and then looked Lucille dead in the eye. "But I overheard something, and I fear he was pushed." Chapter 4. He learned about his wife's father's death from a mere acquaintance at the House of Lords. Reginald felt a bitter taste forming in his mouth, mixed emotions fighting for prominence in his mind. That night, Lucille was not at dinner, and the next morning, she stayed in her room. He wanted to go to her, to comfort her, or at least speak with her, but she'd sent a clear message when she lied to him about the urgent letter. She'd told him that he was not someone she could trust with her deepest fears and tragedies, and then she'd slipped away to handle it all on her own. He hated the thought of those slim shoulders bearing any of the responsibility of a funeral and death investigation, and he determined to learn all he could about the accident that was now the centre of gossip and speculation in the higher spheres of London society. The Duke of Whitehall walked up to him after the House of Lords session the next day, waiting around at the front of the building until most of the lords had rushed off to their carriages and away to their fine estates. Reginald saw him waiting, picking up the loitering with those careful eyes that had served him so well in the past, and waited himself. He liked Augustus, not just because of their shared interest in the Lockridge family, but because in the Caney incident, Augustus Sutton had taken all the public blame to save Reginald, a man he hardly knew, from scandal. Reginald was not one to have friends, but he admired the purity and strength of Augustus's past, and he felt comfortable in the other man's company. "I'm sure Lucille told you," Augustus said in a low voice, "why I missed yesterday's session." Reginald kept his face in an unreadable mask. There was no need to tell this man, who had such a clearly happy marriage with Sarah, that the other Lockridge sister was not so forthcoming with her need in the time of tragedy. Even if she hadn't, he hedged in response, I would have heard about it from the simple page boy on the street. All of London is talking about the gory death of one of its worst. Augustus smiled grimly. You know what they say about speaking ill of the dead? That it might anger the ghosts? Reginald sighed and took a seat on one of the marble benches in the courtyard. Come now, Sutton. You and I have already done that where Edgar Lockridge is concerned. If he's going to haunt anyone, we're already top of his list. Augustus sat too, leaning forward on his knees. It's a sad affair. Did Lucille tell you about the mystery of it all? She had not. Of course, Reginald was gifted at leaving out the exact right amount of information to learn what he needed to. He chose the simplest tactic of them all, answering a question with a question. What do you think of it? I think it's suspicious. And if you'd heard young Edmund's story, you would think the same. Besides, if there was a person you thought would get pushed off his own balcony, it would be Edgar Lockridge. Am I right? The man had so many enemies. The question is not finding a motive, it's narrowing down the suspect field. So he had been pushed, or at least they suspected he'd been pushed. That was new information to Reginald, but, as always, he kept that fact to himself. He'd learned over the years that if one pretended like one knew everything, eventually one actually did. That's not the only reason I wanted to speak with you, Augustus said suddenly, surprising Reginald out of his reverie. It's a matter that came to my attention last week, but I haven't had a chance to speak with you since then. Go on. You're well known in the House of Lords as a man who peddles in secrets. Reginald thought about protesting, but he decided in the end that Augustus had earned the right not to be patronised. He shrugged and smiled grimly instead. Augustus went on. I'm not casting judgment. In fact, that very skill of yours has helped me in the past, and for that, I am nothing but thankful. The problem is that you, my good sir, are careful with the secrets that you trade and careful about the people that you help. And that's a problem. I'm not done. Apparently, there's another man trading secrets behind closed doors. Augustus lowered his voice even further. I don't know who it is. I don't think anyone knows at present. But I found out last week that the scandal involving the bastard son of the third lord from Northampton was broken by this mystery man. Reginald frowned. I thought that was Lockridge. Then an ugly thought crossed his mind. Wait, who did you think it was? Did you think it was me? Augustus was silent. Reginald sighed. That's not my style, Sutton. I don't throw out scandalous information just to ruin men. You should know that by now. Augustus dropped his gaze. What I thought, or didn't think, doesn't matter now. All that matters is that someone, less considerate than you, and certainly more dangerous, is orchestrating scandals that could bring down the House of Lords. The third Lord of Northampton isn't a bad man, and even if he was, I don't think that blackmail and derision is the way to bring him down. Isn't that the way you got your beloved new wife? Reginald regretted his statement instantly, watching a cloud cross Augustus's face. It is, and I'm not proud of it. I wouldn't have wished that scandal on Sarah for all the world, he said quietly. She went behind my back and did it herself, and while I know she thinks she did rightly, I can't say I think it was the right thing. The husbands of the Lockridge women should stick together, Reginald said, more gently than was his wont. He thought about Lucille lying about the funeral and her father's death, and he felt an uncharacteristic sympathy for the Duke of Whitehall beside him. He stood then, starting to walk out across the courtyard at Augustus's side, when suddenly there was a flash in his peripheral vision. Reginald turned, watching the events unfold as if in a series of surreal flashes. There was a man, his face twisted and dirty, his clothes that of a tramp. Hurtling towards him, he saw a flash of metal, heard Augustus cry out a warning, and then felt a sting in his arm and heard the ripping of his coat. In the next instant, his body seemed to catch up with his mind, and he lashed out at the man, pushing him back and away, catching at his arm. The tramp stumbled backward, eyes wide, and then took off down the alley away from Reginald and Augustus. Augustus turned with alarm. "Are you hurt?" Reginald quickly pushed back the torn fabric of his coat and saw blood seeping through. "I think the coat caught the worst of it. A superficial wound." He'd always been eerily calm in the face of crisis, and he felt that clarity descending on him again as he turned to Sutton, noting the man's pale face. "I have to catch him. I'm with you." The two men took off down the alley. Reginald had seen the look in the tramp's eyes, the certainty and deadly calm. He'd seen the face of murderers before, and he was sure that if he hadn't turned to the side, the knife in the man's hand would have hit its mark, his chest or stomach. Both of those would have been mortal wounds, especially if the knife was sharp enough to dig through the thick fabric of his coat and still cut a clean swath through the skin of his arm. Adrenaline coursing through his veins, Reginald found himself easily keeping pace with Augustus, who was a bear of a man, a full head taller than him, with broad shoulders and long, leaping strides. The tramp was not quite as quick, and they gained on him as they went. They would have caught him if it weren't for his path, which took him deeper and deeper into the heart of the slums of London. The streets got narrower and more winding as they went, and then, at a particularly tall tenement, the scrawny little man jumped up and scrambled onto a ladder, going up the side of a building. "Get to him before he reaches the top," Reginald called to Augustus, who had taken the lead. "If he makes the roofs, he can go anywhere in the slums without being stopped." Augustus was ahead of him in the alleyway, and pushing past a tight network of pipes, nodded an affirmative over his shoulder. "Stop right there," he called up to the tramp when he reached the bottom of the ladder. He grabbed it with his big bear-like hands and started to pull it loose. Apparently, Augustus Sutton was a good deal heavier than the scrawny little tramp who'd tried to stab Reginald, for when he pulled himself up on the ladder, it creaked, groaned, and then popped loose of the wall and fell back on Augustus and Reginald. The tramp, luckily for him, had already jumped up to grab the ledge and was dangling for a moment above the two men, his legs flailing in the air. There was a small clatter at Reginald's side, and he turned to see the offending knife had fallen from the man's coat and was lying in the puddle at his side. "Stay there!" Augustus called up again. "We'll come up and pull you over!" But the tramp was stronger than he looked. With a great heave and scramble, he was over the side, not even stopping to look down at his pursuers. For a moment, Reginald and Augustus sat in silence, gasping for air. Augustus looked at Reginald's arm, where the blood had seeped through his coat and was oozing down the fabric. "You should get that seen to," he said gruffly. "No telling what infection we've picked up in a place like this." Reginald ignored him, instead reaching down into the muddy puddle at his feet and pulling out the knife that had fallen there. It was incredibly sharp and fine, like a razor's edge. The blade was long and slender, and the handle was crafted ivory with silver accents. He turned it over in his palm and then tested the blade with his finger. "Does that look like a beggar's weapon to you?" he asked, holding it up to Augustus. Augustus shook his head grimly. He must have stolen it off another one of his victims. "You couldn't take this off a man without him knowing," Reginald said with a hard little laugh. "You'd slice him to shreds in the process." "No, this is an assassin's knife, and I would bet my life, literally, that it was given to our grimy friend with a mission attached." Augustus looked at it with a new look in his eyes. Alarm. You think it wasn't a random attack? Random? Number, I think the tramp was paid a few extra coins to do off with one of the most secret-prone lords in Parliament. That's what I think. Reginald calmly took his handkerchief out of his pocket and wrapped the knife, tucking the now blunted blade into his coat pocket and adjusting his lapels out of habit. We should go back to the House of Lords at once. I need to take my carriage back home and see what I can learn about this whole affair. He looked up and noticed Augustus staring at him with mild approval. You don't seem terribly ruffled by all this. It's almost as though you've had attempts on your life in the past. Me? Reginald let out a sarcastic little laugh. How can that be? You know how likeable I am, and how far I try to stay from the heat of danger. Chapter 5. Lucille knew that she needed to tell Reginald everything when he returned that day. She'd been thinking about it all day, especially after she read a letter from Sarah telling her that the news was out. Everyone in London seemed to know about Edgar Lockridge's untimely death, and Lucille knew that if everyone in London knew, her husband of the gilded tongue and the quick mind certainly knew. She was pacing when she heard his carriage pull up outside, realising with a burst of surprise that she not only needed to tell Reginald, she wanted to. She felt the events of the past day and a half weighing heavily on her heart, and she realised that she wanted the freedom and comfort she had felt for that moment when he'd lain on her lap in the library to return again. She walked to the door and was waiting there by the surprised butler when Reginald walked in. Tell the liveryman to give the horses a little extra care, he was saying over his shoulder to the footman as he walked in. I drove them hard on the way here. He stopped in his tracks when he saw her waiting for him. She well understood why, looking at the state he was in. His fine black coat was ripped, his hair dishevelled and dirty, his eyes a little wild, and was that blood? Despite her need for propriety, Lucille took a few steps towards him, her eyes on the dark stain on his coat. He seemed to have tied a cloth around it, but the blood was soaking through. What happened? She asked softly. He studied her for a moment, as though surprised, a world of secrets behind his eyes. I am all right, he said at last. She could see him building up the same walls she had put up time and again, and she felt suddenly that she couldn't bear it. There he was, clearly wounded and hiding something, and he expected her to do as she'd done since they were married, turn the other direction and pretend everything was all right. She shook her head and set her mouth in a little line. Well, what are we doing standing here? She asked, coming forward and waving her hand at the shocked butler. Quick, go fetch me some hot water and clean bandages. She pulled back the wrap and saw the depth of the slice in Reginald's arm, holding up her hand to stop the butler as she did so. Also, the thinnest needle you can find and some thread. Make that water boiling. She looked up at Reginald. Do you think we can take this coat off? He was staring at her as though he'd never met her before, a little smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I think I can manage it. She led him into the parlour by the fireside and sat him down in a chair, helping him out of the coat and trying not to notice the way he hid the wince of pain from her. Underneath the coat was another long jacket, which also had to be removed, and then a flowing white shirt. She saw that the cut was high on his arm, but when she looked up and saw a hint of teasing in his eyes, she couldn't bring herself to ask for that to be removed as well. Instead, she untied his cravat with trembling hands and, taking her sewing scissors from the table, carefully cut off the sleeve of the shirt at the shoulder. He followed her actions with a curious expression. You're going to owe me a shirt, woman. Wouldn't it have been easier to just take the whole affair off? She blushed and held up the sleeve so he could see the bloody gash in the fabric. I think this sleeve was already done for. The door opened, and a maid hustled in with a kettle of boiling water, a bowl, and a basket, with the other things Lucille had requested. She pulled the basket to her side and inspected it briefly before nodding to the maid. "I think that's all I need for now. The gash doesn't look infected, so there's no need to send for the doctor at present." The maid nodded, sending one last curious look at the couple, and then bowed out of the room. Lucille turned back to Reginald and found his vulpine eyes resting on her face with a curiosity of his own. She lowered her eyes quickly, drawn against her will to the depth in his, confused by the feeling stirring in her chest. She busied herself with the clothes, pouring the steaming water into the basin and pulling out the sterilizing herbs the maid had tucked into a satchel. "I'm going to have to sew up the wound," she said briskly, pulling out the thread and pushing it through the eye of a needle. She took both instruments and put them through the boiling water, then dried off the tip of the needle by sterilizing it in a flame. "First, we have to clean the wound." She set the needle aside and, dipping a cloth into the water, rubbed it gently along the red and angry skin around the cut. Reginald winced once when the cloth first touched his skin, but then he fell silent and let Lucille clean the wound without further complaint. When some of the old, dried blood and debris were free of the wound, Lucille picked up the thread and needle and set to work. It turned her stomach at first to stab the needle through folds of skin instead of the embroidery with which she was ordinarily familiar, but she pushed down the discomfort and fear and focused on the task at hand. If she didn't do it, then they would have to wait for the doctor, and that would expose the wound to more risk of infection. She kept her hands steady, her eyes glued on the task at hand, and her breath even. It took 8 stitches to close the wound, each tied off individually in a perfectly spaced, even line. When finished, Lucille let out her breath and, setting the instruments aside, took a cloth again and began cleaning the outside of the wound more thoroughly before putting the dressing on. "It looks like a clean cut," she said at last, her voice soft. "It must have been a very sharp knife." She ventured a look up at Reginald's face and found his eyes still fastened intently on her head. She ran her gaze along his rumpled clothing and added nervously, "And it looks as if you've been running, perhaps in a back alley of some sort. I think it's time you tell me what's going on." "How did you learn to do this?" he asked instead, sidestepping her question and nodding to her medical handiwork. "Do you find yourself tending to the wounded often?" "I've never done it before," she answered honestly, "but it only takes a bit of common sense to execute." She swallowed hard and gathered her courage yet again. "But I can see that this injury is of a violent nature, perhaps connected with an even more violent event that you are keeping from me. Is it someone you blackmailed? Is someone angry with you because of a secret you've told?" My... He looked off into the fire as she laid a thin paste of herbs along the crease of the stitched wound and began wrapping fine linen around it. "Look who's brave enough to ask the hard questions now." "Don't tease me," she said softly. He was quiet for a moment, and then said in a more sober tone, "No, I suppose I shouldn't tease you, but if you think I can tell you the truth about the events that transpired, you're gravely mistaken." Lucille finished wrapping the clean linen around his arm and pinned the loose end out of sight before leaning back on her heels and rubbing her hands dry on a piece of cloth. "Sir Reginald," she amended, "if we're going to be married in more than name only, then I really ought to know what's going on. I can't live in constant fear that you aren't coming home." She bit her lip and struggled to meet the intensity of her new husband's gaze. "I have as much of a right to know who our enemies are as you do." He leaned forward quite suddenly at that and seized her chin lightly between his thumb and forefinger. He peered at her, his head cocked to one side, and she felt the warm pulse of his heartbeat through his thumb. "Now, that's interesting," he said with mild amusement. "You said our enemies." "That's right," she answered, pulling away. Something about the intimacy of the moment was too strong for her. She put her hand to the place that he had touched, as though to hide it from his gaze. "What of it?" "It's the first time you've said our instead of your. For some reason, my dear, you are choosing to lump our names together in this time of tragedy, when our earlier happiness could not provoke you to the same show of unity." "I was not trying to make a statement," she said, stumbling over her words. "But you are my husband, and I assume that if someone is after you, they are also after me. Now that I have aligned myself with the Crowan name, I suppose I inherit your enemies along with your connections." A cloud crossed his face at that, and Reginald sat back in the chair, wincing as he propped his wounded arm up on his knee. "I don't like that one bit," he said at last. "And I suppose that as much as I would like to think my danger is separate completely from yours, I would be remiss if purposeful blindness were to keep me from protecting you as I ought." A little smile crossed his face as his gaze fell from her eyes down to the pile of bloody clothes and bandages at her side. "You did well today, Lucille. I have a bargain for you. I will tell you my secrets if you will stop acting like a shrinking violet." His language, so coarse and accusatory, made Lucille bristle. Before she could speak, however, Reginald held up his hand and continued, "I know that there is a courageous woman inside of you. I've seen it before." She laughed at that. She couldn't help it. "I think you're mixing me up with the other Lockridge sister." "Sarah is rebellious, yes," he said gravely, the smile leaving all but his eyes. "But bravery isn't just defying the rules." Lucille dropped her gaze to her hands, noting the red blood drying to brown beneath her nails, the rags piled all around, the tear in her skirt where she'd ripped it while kneeling at her husband's feet. Maybe she wasn't such a delicate flower after all. "I don't know how to keep from shrinking away from you," she said at last, unable to look her husband in the eye in this moment of deepest vulnerability. "There are rules to be followed, and I am afraid of what will happen if I stray from them." "What rules?" There was a genuine question in his voice. "You know," she said, with a little laugh and a weak wave of her hand. "The things my father taught me since I was a little girl. The things that all young women must adhere to if they are to maintain a good place in society." "Your father taught you ill, then," Reginald interjected wryly, "for the Lockridge sisters aren't exactly the height of society at the moment." Then, as though he could see the stab of pain this comment brought, he sobered and asked gently, "Tell me what rules he levelled on you girls." Lucille raised her eyes briefly to his, and then lowered them again. "I'm not to look you, or any man, in the eye, especially not in an intimate setting. It comes across as a challenge of intellect, and flirtatious, you know." "Aha," he said dryly. "And I shouldn't speak to you or to any of your acquaintances without your express permission, nor should I voice my own opinions." A particularly painful memory worked its way to the surface, and Lucille shoved it back down again, saying only, "In fact, I shouldn't have any sort of opinion on serious matters. It's not seemly. It might even be dangerous. I'm to keep my thoughts occupied only with fashion and poetry, and the stuff that makes up the accomplishments of a proper society lady. Nothing else. If I attempt to comment on politics or the social order, I run the risk of voicing an opinion not held by the majority of the room, and that is political suicide for the man in my life. That would be you." "Me, of course," Reginald said, and Lucille heard the sarcasm in his voice. She pressed on before she lost her nerve. And the most important rule of all to my father was this, that I never, ever contradict or embarrass him. And you think that that rule, or any of them for that matter, are held in high esteem by me? Lucille could hear the incredulity in her husband's voice, but she couldn't understand it, and so just sat still, her eyes fixed on her lap, while she waited for an explanation. It came in the form of Reginald's long, slim hand, covering hers and pulling her up from her knees to sit beside him on the settee. "Well, my dear," he said, tipping her chin up again to meet his gaze, "we will need to begin defying your father's outdated and idiotic rules as quickly as possible. We will work our way out of that prison to the courage and fortitude that I know you are capable of." His eyes pierced her soul, and he held her gaze as he whispered the last sentence as tenderly as if she were something delicate and precious that he didn't want to lose. "And we will start with the first rule," he said, "for I love the colour of your eyes and I wish to see them whenever I can." Chapter 6 There was a pool Reginald had seen once when he was a boy in the southern part of the country, tucked away in a quiet little grove of trees. It had been overshadowed by a few hanging willows, and in the depths of its clear waters you could see the sun dancing along smooth brown pebbles. He thought of that pool now, as he stared into his young wife's eyes. They were emerald, deep, with flecks of gold like the light on the pebbles. He had to force himself to look away from her, releasing her chin and standing abruptly to fetch a deck of cards from the nearby cabinet. His back to her in this gesture, he composed himself. She was so beautiful, and she so clearly didn't know. He couldn't imagine how a woman so kind and gentle and lovely had been deprived of the knowledge that she possessed so many alluring traits. His blood boiled to think what the now departed Edgar Lockridge had done to his daughter. He wanted to tell everything to those deep green eyes, but he was afraid that if Lucille knew every part of him, she would think him a monster. He turned and tried to put an encouraging smile on his face. Small steps. "Do you have a bit of time on your hands?" he asked kindly. "I would like to teach you something." He didn't miss the light in her eyes at the word teach. Her hunger for knowledge was not surprising, considering how curated her childhood had been, and he was happy to satisfy it. She nodded. "Is it a difficult thing?" "Some think it is." He raised an eyebrow and sat again on the settee near her, clearing a space between them to deal out a hand. Why? Does that make a difference? The implication that he thought her capable of difficult things seemed to give her new courage, and she drew her little shoulders up even straighter. "No, I'm just curious." She cocked her head. "What is the game? A bit of whist?" "No," he said, unable to contain an impish smile as he kept his eyes on the cards. "No. Whist is for polite parlour rooms and old women in need of excitement. You, my dear, are going to learn how to play poker." Her silence forced him to look up, and he almost laughed when he saw the scandalised look in her soft eyes. "I've never played poker," she choked out through tight lips. "I've never played any card game, actually." "Really?" he asked dryly. "Don't tell me your father disapproved of a bit of sport too." His friend, Lawrence Notley, came to ruin by gambling, and he never allowed us to learn. Not even Edmund. "Well, I wouldn't want to bring you to ruin." He meant for there to be a grain of flirtation in his tone, and when Lucille's eyes darted up to meet his in mild surprise, he knew he'd succeeded. He shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant as usual, though her presence was throwing him increasingly for a loop. He affected a teasing tone and pretended to put the pack of cards away. "On second thought, you do seem like the kind of woman who would get caught up in underground card games and gamble away my fortune." Perhaps. No, teach me. She laughed suddenly, and the sound was like the tinkling of fairy laughter in the large room. It sent a shiver of delight up Reginald's spine, hearing her pure, unadulterated joy. He pretended to hesitate, meeting her laughing eyes, and then reluctantly handed the pack of cards back over to her. "You'd best be careful, woman," he teased. "You'll be the end of me yet." "Now that would be truly unfortunate," she said, almost under her breath. She fumbled a bit with the cards, turning them over and inspecting the artwork inside before trying and failing to shuffle them. "Allow me." He took the cards and flipped them through his fingers in an expert shuffling move, allowing the familiar sound of the cards whirring past one another to bring him some calm and peace. He dealt her 3 cards, and then himself, then dealt another batch of 3 cards face up. "We'll start with the game of commerce," he explained, waving his hand to the 3 cards staring upwards in the middle of the table. "Those 3 comprise the widow. Now, before looking at your cards," he put a hand out quickly to keep Lucille from turning hers over. "We get a chance to make our hand by exchanging with the cards in the middle. I can choose up to 2 from my hand and take one of mine without looking and turn it over." "Choose?" Lucille asked, cocking her head. "But how can you choose something blindly?" Reginald smiled. "That's where part of the gamble comes in. Before the game starts, you put something in the pool in the centre of the table, an ante, as it were, and from there the pool builds until you win or lose." He sighed. "But I'm getting away from myself. When you've determined what you want in your hand, we begin. I will turn over one of these cards every round." He added a fresh card to the widow to demonstrate, "and you will try to make one of these combinations." He slid a card with explanations of the desirable combinations across the settee to Lucille, who looked at it with interest. "When you have collected what you desire, or when you are ready to pretend you've collected what you desire, you knock on the table. I will get one more chance to play, and then we will bid on whether or not we think we have the best hand. There are other tips you'll learn later, but for now, let's begin." "So, a tricon is 3 of a kind?" she asked, peering at the card. "Yes. And a sequence is in the same suit and sequence. A flush is 3 cards of the same suit, and a pair is self-explanatory." "Exactly," Lucille bit her lip. "It doesn't feel like there is much strategy." "There is. But it is not like chess or one of those other strategy-heavy games where all the strategy is found in the gameplay. No, this is an intellectual strategy of the mind that I want to encourage in you, a strategy of social clues and reading a person's face for tells. You should watch me always to see whether or not you think I'm bluffing, whether or not the new cards in the widow help me, and whether or not I'm giving something away without meaning to." She nodded in silence, and Reginald wondered if he'd started off too quickly. He softened his tone. "It's a good skill to have, Lucille. You say you want to break out of your father's mould, and I think this is a good way to practice. You can use these skills, watching to see if people are lying, thinking on your feet when deception is needed, in daily life." "All right." She handed her cards back to him. "Deal me again." He did so quickly, and the widow turned over only a 7, a 2, and a jack. "Poor widow," Reginald said with a little laugh. "She's got poverty today." Lucille wrinkled her eyebrow when looking at the pile, looked at what was in her hands, and then pursed her lips. "Now is it my turn?" "No." Reginald tapped his fingers on the top of his turned-over hand. "I have to decide if I think anything in the widow is better than what's in my hand." He shrugged. "And I don't think it is." "Me neither." She gave a weak little smile. "But I thought you said first we need to set up a pool of money." And you said you didn't want to turn into a compulsive gambler, he reminded her. I think we ought to play for some stakes, she said. A little smile, so rare and so sweet, came onto her face. Unless you're afraid. He watched her emerald eyes for a moment and then shrugged. All right. If you want to lose something valuable to me today, who am I to stop you? He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy purse, throwing the entire thing onto the settee between them. And if I win. Lucille blushed and slid her hand into her own pocket. I haven't any coin on me. She made as if to stand. I'll go get it from upstairs. Or not, he said quickly, reaching out his good arm to detain her. Or you could kiss me if I win. She blushed and seemed to be deciding whether it was worth the cost. Then she shrugged and, swallowing hard, agreed. All right. Suddenly, Reginald felt himself more invested in winning than he'd previously been. There was a time for losing on purpose to a student learning a new game, but with this new incentive, he decided the time was not today. He had a queen and a king of spades in his hand, and there was hope for more to be turned over, so he thought he had a fighting chance. He looked up and waited for Lucille to make her first decision. Her face looked worried, and he saw a little line of concern on her forehead. I can't do anything, she said, turning the full force of her eyes in his direction. What now? First, he said with a teasing smile. You don't tell me you can't do anything. Just say that you want to turn over the widow and see what more is available. All right, she said, biting her lip. I want to turn over the widow. He did so, exposing another two. He rolled his eyes. This has turned out to be an exciting game indeed. The back and forth continued for a few minutes, but to Reginald they seemed to stretch into years. He was distracted by her eyes, which she seemed to have gained confidence in turning in his direction. She was beginning to hold steady eye contact, studying him with genuine interest, and what he could see was a marked intellect. He could clearly see that she had a subpar hand, and when she refused to draw or lay down anything, he knew that her idea of the way the game should unfold was not well-founded. He would have taken the time to correct her if it weren't for the kiss on the line. Finally, he knocked. There was a king, a queen, and a jack in his hand of the same suit. It was one of the strongest sequences a person could have, and he was ready to claim his loot. She allowed her last turn to come and go, and then looked up at him with those wide green pools of hers. He saw it then, what he'd missed before in his enchantment, but would never have missed if he were playing opposite a man, the subtle, restrained triumph of a good hand. He turned his over slowly, and when her eyes lit on it, she tilted her head to the side and let a gentle smile slip from between her lips. That's good, she said. And you're patronizing your teacher, he said with quiet admiration, not at all surprised to see her turn over 3 aces in the next moment. You won. I had a good hand. And you played it well. He had always been gracious in defeat. It was the classy thing to do, but this defeat hurt more than most. He pushed the money to her, longing for the taste of her lips denied him. I didn't notice you were keeping anything from me until it was too late. I'm surprised you didn't notice, she said softly, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she examined the coin purse in her hands. I know this is what you do for a living, reading people. I was distracted. She didn't look up at that, and Reginald felt a nudge in his conscience that was unexpected. Lucille, he said, clearing his throat a bit, you asked about the blackmail that you found in your father's study a few days back. At the time, I didn't answer you, but if you ask me again, I would like another chance to try. She raised her eyes to his, surprise lingering there in the depths. All right, she said slowly. Then I will ask you, why was your name on the sheet of blackmail I burned? Reginald worked his jaw for a moment and then dove in blindly. Years ago, I was at a hunting retreat with some young lords, including your new brother-in-law and a man named Isaac Caney. Isaac was a difficult man. He was very drunk and out of sorts, and he impugned the honour of a woman that I fancied. We fought, and a shot went off. When the dust had cleared, Isaac was dead. He went on quickly, before he lost his nerve. Augustus took responsibility for it, although no one knew for sure what had happened, and that is why your father thought he had a scoop on the man. Lucille had frozen while he spoke, and now, as she spoke, Reginald got the eerie feeling that he was looking at a marble statue. Did you? Did I what? Kill him? She blinked once, her voice shaking ever so slightly. Did you shoot Isaac Caney? He took a deep breath. The bullet ricocheted. I don't know. That's the truth. I wish I could deny it, Lucille, but I just don't know. Chapter 7. The memory of Reginald's card lesson and his confession immediately after lingered in Lucille's mind over the following few days. She found herself looking for him instead of avoiding him, but when she did, she realised how often he was really gone from the house. She missed him. She wasn't sure what to believe about the Isaac Caney business, or what culpability Reginald really had, but she had seen the truth in his eyes. He hadn't meant to kill Caney, and he honestly didn't know if the lethal shot had been fired from his gun. That was enough for now. 3 days after the lesson, Lucille at last decided she couldn't wait any longer around the house. She answered an invitation sent by one of Sarah's friends to attend a poetry reading at a manor in the heart of the city. She wanted to speak with Sarah about their father's death and the investigation, but also hoped that Reginald would find some time to sneak away from his business at the House of Lords to attend. She was disappointed in the latter desire almost as soon as she walked in the door. Although Sarah was already sitting across the room on a low settee, arrayed in royal blue with her brilliant eyes shining, neither Augustus nor Reginald were in view. The session's running long today, Sarah said in explanation when Lucille walked to her side. Lucille and Sarah had rarely appeared together in public before the events of the last year. That's how the ruse with Augustus went off so well. Now, the twins were regularly attending events in each other's company. Lucille had noticed for the first time the significant questioning looks, the whispers behind fans, the feeling of discomfort. Sarah seemed not to notice at all. She was brazen and brave and full of conversation. I'm so glad you could come, Sarah said, laying her hand on Lucille's arm. These things can seem so tedious, what with everyone having the same exact things to say, the same interests, the same boring societal standards. I even think people are beginning to forget the scandal of my fictional involvement with a local tailor, and while I'm thankful for a reprieve from the gossips, I'm annoyed that social functions have once again become merely drab affairs with nothing of substance. Scandal is not necessarily substance, Lucille said gently. Sarah cocked her head and Lucille saw a familiar look come into her eyes, a curiosity. What's different about you today, sister? You look more alert, somehow. Lucille softened her face at once and blushed. She didn't want to seem different, even though she felt as though Reginald's attention was blossoming her as surely as sun and rain brought the flowers back to life in the spring. Sarah had used a descriptive word that was more apt than she even knew. Alert. That's exactly how Lucille felt, as though the world around her was more alive with interest and things to notice than ever before. She remembered Reginald's connection between the art of calling someone's bluff in poker and the same art in real life. She felt as though her eyes were suddenly opened to an entire world she had not known until now. She smiled and stuttered a nervous response. "I'm sure I'm not different." Seeking to turn her sister's attention away, she waved her hands weakly at one of the young ladies they'd grown up with years before. "And everything's not so very the same, is it? You may find things tedious, but Annabeth, for example, is looking particularly piqued and keeps watching the door as though she's afraid of something. I think she has a gentleman caller she wishes to avoid." She looked at Annabeth in silence for a moment, only turning back to Sarah when she felt the heat of her sister's puzzled gaze on her face. "What?" she asked. Sarah gave a little laugh. "Nothing. That is just very observant of you. I hadn't noticed anything amiss with Annabeth." Lucille shrugged. "I don't know if it's amiss exactly. Perhaps she's just worried the gentleman won't be in attendance." Before Sarah could ask another question, the performance was called to order in the adjoining room, and both sisters moved with the crowd of attendees into the parlour with its magnificent chandelier and the fine miniature stage set up at one end of the room. They took their seats side by side, along with the rest, giving Lucille hope that they would be able to talk at last about their father's last days and will, and turned towards the front of the room. A pale little woman, the daughter of the hostess who had afforded her home as a place for the poetry reading, took her place on the stage, pushed back a wisp of brown hair, and began to read in a trembling tone from an essay on man by Alexander Pope. "Say first, of God above or man below, what can we reason but from what we know? Of man what see we but his station here, from which to reason, or to which refer? Through worlds unnumbered though the God be known, 'tis ours to trace him only in our own." The heroic couplets chased after each other through the sombre state of the room, and when she was sure she would not cause a disturbance, Lucille leaned over to whisper in her sister's ear, "Can I tear you away from the entertainment to ask about father?" Sarah, keeping her eyes trained on the front of the room, risked the ghost of a smile. "Perhaps, if our hosts had begun with something a bit more frolicking, you would have difficulty doing so, but I think I can bear to leave Mr. Pope at present." She turned her head ever so slightly to her sister. "What is it you think of this entire affair?" "I was wondering if you had any new information on the cause of his death, or the strange circumstances Edmund suggests." Sarah nodded, as though she did indeed hold some new insight on the case, but when she opened her mouth to speak, Lucille felt the heavy, ringed fingers of their hostess fall on her shoulder. She gave a little jump of alarm and turned in time to hear the lady whispering to Sarah, "It's more difficult than you know to tell you two ladies apart when your husbands aren't here to show me which is which. You're Sarah, aren't you?" The elderly woman hissed more loudly than Lucille would have liked. Sarah nodded stiffly and exchanged a glance with her sister. "Good." The matron went on in a poor attempt at a whisper. "Then would you come over here to speak with me? I have a question for your husband, and I know that the wife is the ears of the man, so to speak." Sarah tried to protest, but in a moment the older woman had pulled her to the corner of the room and was filling her ears with all manner of suggestions for the House of Lords. Lucille had seen such a thing before with her sister, and wondered that the same fate so rarely befell her. She believed that the reason was simple. People were afraid of Reginald, and they were willing to cross boundaries with Augustus that they would not entertain with Lucille's husband. Sighing, she began looking again around the room and found, with surprise, that her sister's friend Margaret was in attendance. Margaret was a slip of a girl with dark curling hair and wide dark eyes. She'd always been very close to Sarah, although the two rarely got to see each other, and, as an extension, she knew Lucille. It was surprising that she hadn't walked up to the twins yet, but with the new vision Reginald had gifted to Lucille, she was able to see the reason. There was a shine of tears on Margaret's cheeks as she sat in the corner, half hidden in the shadow of a drapery, eyeing the stage with a vacant stare. Whatever she was really looking at was far beyond that drapery. Something was troubling her. In the next moment, as though the hostess read her thoughts, the pale girl on stage drew her recitation to a blessed close, and the hostess announced in a booming voice that Miss Margaret would be performing next. Margaret was strong and smart, much more like Sarah than Lucille in Lucille's shrinking opinion, and she fully expected a rousing and perhaps slightly scandalous recitation from the girl. What she got instead was a stark contrast. Margaret stood in front of the room, her hands at her sides and her eyes barely holding back tears, and spoke so softly Lucille almost couldn't hear. "I will be reciting a poem from the illuminated manuscripts of William Blake," she said. Lucille saw her fingers playing with the edge of her skirts like a child. She began to recite in an even but subdued tone. "Little lamb, who made thee, dost thou know who made thee, gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead?" Lucille knew the poem well, and so she noticed at once when Margaret skipped the end of the first verse and beginning of the next to shorten the whole recitation. "I a child and thou a lamb, we are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee, little lamb, God bless thee." Margaret choked out the last few lines as though she could barely speak, and then hurried from the stage back to her place. As the hostess's voice boomed again in introduction of another poetry recitation, Lucille found herself staring hard at Margaret. She should ask what was wrong, she knew she should, and yet it was more the manner of thing that Sarah would do. That's why Sarah and Margaret were friends, after all. They were both confident enough to speak what needed to be said. Lucille turned, almost ready to point out the problem to Sarah and let her handle it. But then she thought about, a few nights ago, when Reginald had claimed that he knew her well enough to think her courageous. Whatever Reginald had seen in her, Lucille wanted to be that woman, and not the frightened, anxious one who sat silently in this chair, too anxious to extend a few words of comfort to a friend. Abruptly, sucking in her breath as some sort of bravery elixir, Lucille stood and made her way as inconspicuously as possible to Margaret's side. She must have done a good job, for when she sat down softly, Margaret looked up with an expression of surprise. Lucille could see that the tears were gone from her eyes, but her face still looked strained and pale. "Lucille," she said, obviously trying to appear light-hearted, "how are you?" "I'm well." Lucille bit her lip. That wasn't what she needed to say. She needed to find a way to steer the conversation towards Margaret's emotions, not her own. "I am surprised to see you here tonight," she said nervously. "I know that you live far out of town and can't often attend. It was worth my while to come." Margaret's face looked as though she wanted very much to be left alone. Lucille wanted nothing more than to give her this desire, but that same steady nudge that had been awakened in her the night of the poker lesson wouldn't give her an escape. She took another breath and looked Margaret full in the face. "Something is wrong," she said, kicking herself for the abrupt manner in which she spoke, her lack of tact. "Please tell me what is troubling you, Margaret. I can see full well that the weight of the world is on your shoulders." Margaret blinked and stared at her for a moment in silence. Then she relented, tears coming back into her eyes. "How did you know?" she asked softly. "I just had a feeling." Lucille reached out tentatively and touched her shoulder. "Please, what is wrong?" "I thought I would never tell anyone this, much less someone from your own family." Margaret trailed off. "But I'm so alone, Lucille. I don't know what to do. and I don't have anyone I can talk to about this. She swallowed hard. You know, after enduring your father's house, everything there is to know about blackmail, correct? I know more than I care to know, yes, she answered honestly. Margaret went on, gathering courage as she spoke. Someone, I don't know who, is blackmailing me. They have a horrible secret. It's absolutely horrible. No, don't look at me like that, Lucille. I can't tell you what it is, but you must believe me that it is awful. And they have promised to reveal everything. Lucille reached out and took her friend's hand tenderly. She summoned every ounce of courage she had, and some she didn't think she possessed, and answered as Reginald would have done. I don't understand this situation fully, but I will do everything in my power to help.
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the full book. The full audiobook will be available on YouTube in a few days. What did you like the most? Comment below and share this video on your social media and with your friends. Watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.